The auctioneer's gavel cracked like thunder against the wooden podium as Colt Maverick's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. Sold to Harlan Crowfeet for $800. Colt's weathered hands trembled as he watched the banker stride forward with a satisfied smirk, claiming ownership of the Wildflower Ranch and, with it, any chance of winning back Magnolia Bell's hand. The woman he'd loved since childhood stood frozen on the courthouse steps, her emerald eyes wide with disbelief as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. "No," she whispered, but her voice carried across the silent crowd like a battle cry. "This isn't over." Magnolia had mortgaged her late father's ranch to pay for her younger brother's medical treatments back east, never imagining the drought would make it impossible to repay the loan. Now, according to the cruel terms of the foreclosure, she had become part of the property in old territorial law that bound unmarried women to the land they couldn't maintain alone. Colt pushed through the stunned townspeople, his spurs jangling against the dusty ground. "Aggie, I'll find another way. I swear on my mother's grave your cattle money wasn't enough."
"Cowboy!"
Harlan sneered, mopping his sweating brow with a silk handkerchief. The crowd gasped as Magnolia stepped forward, her chin lifted with fierce determination. She wore her Sunday best, a cornflower blue dress that brought out the fire in her eyes and the steel in her spine. "Mr. Crowfeet, you may have won the bid, but you haven't won me. There's still one more option under territorial law." The banker's smug expression faltered. "What are you talking about, woman?" "The right of community claim," she announced, her voice ringing clear across the courthouse square. "If the townspeople can collectively match your bid within 7 days, they can purchase the property in my freedom as a community trust." Old Judge Hartwell nodded slowly from his seat on the courthouse steps. "She's right, Crowfeet. It's an old law, rarely invoked, but still valid." Harlan's face flushed purple. With rage? $800? These dirt farmers don't have 800 cents between them? But Magnolia was already turning to face the crowd of familiar faces, shopkeepers, farmers, miners, and townsfolk who'd known her since she was a pigtailed girl racing her horse through the streets. Friends, neighbors. "I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to remain free, to keep my land, and to choose my own destiny." Colt stepped beside her, his hand finding hers. "Whatever we can raise together, we'll find a way to make up the difference." 7 days, Judge Hartwell called out. "The community has 7 days to match the bid, or Miss Bell becomes Mr. Crowfeet's property." As the crowd began to murmur and disperse, Magnolia squeezed Colt's hand tighter. She had 1 week to rally an entire town, convince them to pool their precious savings, and prove that love and community could triumph over greed and power. The fight for her freedom and her future with Colt had only just begun. By dawn the next morning, Magnolia had already knocked on 12 doors. She stood now on the porch of Widow Esperanza Morales, the town's most respected seamstress, holding a ledger book and wearing the same blue dress from yesterday, her only good one. "Mia," Esperanza said softly, opening her door wider. "Come. And I've been expecting you." The tiny adobe house smelled of fresh tortillas and lavender soap. Esperanza poured coffee from a clay pot while Magnolia explained her plan. "I'm not asking anyone to give what they can't spare. But if we can organize this like a barn raising, everyone contributing what they can, when they can, how much do we have so far?" Esperanza asked, settling into her rocking chair. Magnolia opened her ledger with trembling fingers. $17.37. Her voice cracked. "Colt sold his horse yesterday for $40. The blacksmith, Tobias Ironhand, gave $5. Mrs. Patience Cornwell from the general store contributed $7.37 from her pickle jar savings." Esperanza reached into her sewing basket and pulled out a worn leather pouch. She counted out 23 silver dollars, nearly 3 months of her seamstress earnings. "For you, Mia. For all of us who remember what it means to choose our own path." Tears spilled down Magnolia's cheeks. "Esperanza, I can't. You can, and you will." The older woman pressed the coins into Magnolia's palm. "My grandmother was sold like cattle in the old country. Never again. Not in my town." Word spread like wildfire through Sweetwater Creek. By noon, Magnolia found herself at the Silver Dollar Saloon, an unlikely place for a lady, but exactly where she needed to be. The miners and ranch hands looked up from their card games as she entered, her ledger clutched against her chest. "Gentlemen," she announced, her voice steady, despite her racing heart. "I need your help." Big lumberjack Murphy stood up from his corner table, all 6 feet 6 inches of him, casting a shadow across the sawdust floor. "Miss Bell, what that banker's doing ain't right. Legal maybe, but not right." "Then help me make it right," Magnolia replied. "Every penny counts." Murphy reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a gold piece. His lucky $20 coin that he'd carried through 3 mining seasons. Been saving this for something special. Can't think of nothing more special than keeping our town's finest lady free to choose her own happiness. One by one, the rough men approached her table. Cowboys emptied their pockets of wadded bills and loose change. Miners contributed silver dust in small pouches. The saloon keeper, Diamond Lil, donated the contents of her tip jar $36 collected from grateful patrons over the past month. By evening, Magnolia's ledger showed $143.12, still far short of $800, but progress that made her heart soar with hope. Colt found her sitting on the courthouse steps as the sun painted the sky in shades of rose and gold. Counting and recounting the contributions, he settled beside her, his arm encircling her shoulders. "5 more days," he murmured into her hair. "We're going to do this, Maggie. Somehow, we're going to do this." She leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his unwavering faith. "The whole town's talking about it. Mrs. Cornwell says she's never seen anything like it. People arguing over who gets to contribute more." "That's the spirit of Sweetwater Creek," Colt said. "Your father would be proud." Magnolia looked up at the stars beginning to twinkle in the darkening sky. Somewhere out there, her father's spirit was watching, and she would not let his legacy or her love for Colt's slip away without the fight of her lifetime. On the 3rd day, Trouble arrived wearing a 3-piece suit and riding in a black carriage that raised clouds of dust through Sweetwater Creek's Main Street. Magnolia was helping Mrs. Cornwell organize donated goods in the general store when the door chimes announced an unwelcome visitor. "Miss Bell," Harlan Crowfeet sneered, removing his hat with mock politeness. "I hear you've been busy stirring up my future neighbors." Magnolia straightened, placing herself protectively in front of elderly Mrs. Cornwell. "Mr. Crowfeet, come to gloat over your victory?" "Actually, I've come with a generous offer." He pulled out a leather document case and extracted an official-looking paper. "I'm prepared to release you from the property claim in exchange for your signed agreement to leave Sweetwater Creek permanently. We'll have enough money to start fresh somewhere far from here." Mrs. Cornwell gasped, but Magnolia's eyes blazed with fury. "You want to buy me out of my own town?" $500, Miss Bell. More money than most folks around here see in 5 years. His smile was oily and self-satisfied. "All you have to do is abandon this foolish community fundraising and disappear and leave Colt, that drifting cowboy." Harlan laughed harshly. "What can he offer you? A life of uncertainty, scraping by season to season. I can give you security, comfort. You can give me nothing I want." Magnolia interrupted, her voice carrying the authority her father had taught her. "My answer is no, Mr. Crowfeet. Today, tomorrow, and every day after." Harlan's facade cracked, revealing the cruel man beneath. "Then you'll have the life you deserve, serving my household, until you learn proper respect for your betters." After he left, Mrs. Cornwell locked the door and pulled down the window shades. "That man frightens me, dear. He's got influence with the territorial government. What if he tries to change the law?" But Magnolia was already moving, her mind racing with new determination. "Then we'd better work faster." She spent the afternoon at the schoolhouse, where teacher Melody Lightwood had called a special meeting.
Ow.
The room buzzed with conversation, as parents, children, and community elders crowded onto the small benches. "We need to think beyond individual donations." Magnolia addressed the group. "We need events, projects, ways to raise larger amounts quickly. Young Billy Sweetgrass, barely 16 but wise beyond his years, raised his hand. What about the harvest dance? It's next weekend anyway. We could charge admission, hold auctions. Brilliant. Melody clapped her hands together. We could auction pies, quilts, preserves. And I could organize a horse race, added Ranger Jake Thunderbolt, the town's part-time lawman. Winner takes half the entry fees. Other half goes to Magnolia's fund. Old-timer Phoenix Goldstrike, the town's oldest resident at 82, struggled to his feet. In my day, we settled matters with community barn raisings. But this here's a freedom raising. Count me in for organizing the men's log-splitting contest. The energy in the room was electric. Ideas flew faster than Magnolia could write them down. A bake sale, a quilting bee, a shooting competition. Even a children's pet show, every suggestion met with enthusiastic support. By the time they adjourned, they'd planned 3 days' worth of fundraising events leading up to the Saturday deadline. The ledger now showed $207, still daunting, a progress that made the impossible seem merely improbable. As the crowd dispersed, Colt appeared at Magnolia's elbow. I've been thinking about Crowfeet's offer. Her heart nearly stopped. Colt, not for you to take it, he said quickly, pulling her into his arms. But it tells us something important, he was worried. A man who was confident in his victory wouldn't be trying to buy his way out of a fair fight. Magnolia rested her head against his chest, listening to his steady heartbeat. 4 more days, he agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Then you'll be free to marry whoever you choose. The unspoken question hung in the air between them, but there would be time for marriage proposals after they won her freedom. Right now, they had a town to rally and a future to fight for. The morning of the 4th day brought devastating news. Magnolia stood in the ashes of what had been the town's largest barn, home to the harvest dance and their biggest fundraising event. The fire had burned through the night, leaving only blackened timber and crushed dreams. Accident, my foot, growled Tobias Ironhand, kicking at a piece of charred wood. That fire was set deliberate. Smelled that kerosene? Sheriff Jake Thunderbolt knelt beside the ruins, examining scorch marks that told a clear story. Started in 3 different places. This was arson, pure and simple. Magnolia felt the weight of defeat pressing down on her shoulders. The harvest dance would have raised at least $200 money they desperately needed, with only 3 days remaining. Around her, townspeople stood in stunned silence, their faces reflecting her own despair. That's it then, whispered Mrs. Cornwell. Without the barn, we can't hold the dance. Without the dance. We don't give up, Magnolia said firmly, though her heart was breaking. We find another way. But Harlan Crowfeet chose that moment to make his appearance. Arriving in his fine carriage with 2 territorial marshals flanking him, he stepped down with exaggerated concern, surveying the destruction with mock sympathy. Such a terrible tragedy, he said loudly enough for everyone to hear. I hope no one was hurt in this. Unfortunate accident. Colt stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt. Funny how your accidents happen just when they help you most, Crowfeet. Careful, Cowboy, one of the marshals warned. Mr. Crowfeet is under territorial protection as a government-appointed land administrator. Which means, Harlan continued smoothly, that I have the authority to ensure public safety. I'm afraid I'll have to prohibit any large gatherings until this fire can be properly investigated. Wouldn't want another tragedy. The crowd erupted in angry shouts, but the marshal's presence kept them from becoming a mob. Magnolia watched her last hope crumble as effectively as the barn's charred remains. Miss Belle Harlan approached her with false sympathy. Perhaps now you'll reconsider my generous offer. This unfortunate incident shows how dangerous it can be when communities get ... overly excited. Before Magnolia could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Is that a threat, Crowfeet? Everyone turned to see a striking woman dismounting from a black stallion. She wore men's riding clothes and a gun belt. Her silver hair braided down her back despite being no more than 30 years old. Behind her rode 6 more horsemen, all wearing the distinctive silver badges of territorial rangers. Captain Storm Nightingale, Jake Thunderbolt said with obvious relief. Didn't expect to see you in Sweetwater Creek. Got word there might be some irregularities. In territorial land acquisitions, Storm replied coolly, her gray eyes fixed on Harlan. Funny thing about barn fires, they tend to leave evidence. Harlan's face paled, but he maintained his composure. Captain, I assure you this was merely an accident. We'll see about that. Storm turned to address the crowd. Citizens of Sweetwater Creek, territorial law protects your right to peaceful assembly and community fundraising. Any interference with those rights is a federal crime. The marshals accompanying Harlan suddenly looked uncomfortable, clearly outranked by Storm's territorial Rangers. Furthermore, Storm continued, I've been authorized to extend the community claim deadline by 3 days to account for any irregularities that might have impeded the legal process. Magnolia felt her heart leap with renewed hope. 6 days instead of 3? It wasn't much, but it might be enough. This is highly irregular, Harlan began. So is arson. Storm cut him off. Rangers, please escort Mr. Crowfeet back to his hotel while we investigate this fire. And gentlemen, she addressed the territorial marshals, your services are no longer needed here. As the authorities departed, Storm approached Magnolia with a slight smile. Miss Bell, I presume? I knew your father. He once helped my rangers track down cattle rustlers through these parts. Good man would hate to see his daughter railroaded by a corrupt banker. Thank you, Captain Magnolia, managed through tears of gratitude. But even with extra time, I don't know how we'll raise the money without the harvest dance. Storm's smile widened. Well, it just so happens that my rangers and I will be camped outside town for the next week. We get mighty bored on patrol. Might be willing to pay good money for some proper entertainment. Hope bloomed in Magnolia's chest like wildflowers after rain. They still had a fighting chance. The makeshift festival that sprang up in Sweetwater. Creek's town square over the next 3 days became legendary throughout the territory, with Captain Storm Nightingale's rangers providing both security and enthusiastic participation. The entire community threw themselves into the fundraising effort with renewed vigor. Magnolia stood on a wooden platform made from salvaged lumber, calling out bids for the quilt auction. Do I hear $15 for Mrs. Esperanza's wedding ring pattern? 20? Shouted Ranger Buck Silverstream, holding up his hand with a grin. My ma would tan my hide if I let a quilt like that get away. The crowd laughed and cheered as bidding spiraled higher. Colt worked the edges of the gathering, collecting money and updating their running total. $367, now more than halfway to their goal. At the pie contest table, Storm Nightingale was judging entries with theatrical seriousness, awarding prizes that carried cash rewards donated by the Rangers. Her men had contributed generously, treating the fundraising like the most important mission they'd ever undertaken. This here apple pie, Storm announced, holding up a golden-crusted beauty, deserves the $20 grand prize for most likely to make a ranger forget his duties. Diamond Lil laughed from behind her booth where she was selling barbecued beef donated by local ranchers. Captain, you haven't tried my peach cobbler yet? The atmosphere was festive, almost carnival-like, but beneath the celebration, tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Everyone knew Harlan Crowfeet was watching from his hotel window, no doubt planning his next move. As evening approached, Colt found Magnolia counting the day's earnings behind the general store. $412? She said, her voice tight with exhaustion and stress. We're so close, Colt, but we're running out of time and ideas. He pulled her into his arms, feeling the tremor in her hands. Maggie, there's something I need to tell you, something I've been thinking about all week. She looked up at him, seeing something new in his eyes, a resolve that hadn't been there before. I've got one more option, he said quietly. There's a high-stakes poker game tomorrow night, invitation only, biggest game in the territory. Winner takes all usually runs about $500. Magnolia's heart sank. Colt, no. You're not a professional gambler. Those men would eat you alive. I'm better than you think, he replied with a rueful smile. Spent 3 years working riverboats before I became a cowboy. I can hold my own, and if you lose, we'd lose everything. We've raised so far. If I don't try, we lose anyway. We need $400 more, and we've got less than 2 days to raise it. She wanted to argue to find another way, but the mathematics were brutal. They'd exhausted every conventional fundraising option in a town this size. "There's more," Colt continued. "The game is being held at Crowfeet's hotel, one of the players." Magnolia's eyes widened with understanding. "You think he'll cheat?" "I know he'll try, but I also know he's arrogant. You won't expect a simple cowboy to outplay him at his own game." Before she could respond, Storm Nightingale appeared around the corner, her expression grim. "Sorry to interrupt, but we've got problems. My investigation turned up some interesting information about Mr. Crowfeet's business practices." She pulled out an official-looking document. 3 other towns in the past 2 years, same pattern, mysterious. Fires, intimidation, suspicious land acquisitions. The territorial government is very interested in his activities. "Interested enough to stop him?" Magnolia asked hopefully. "It's eventually, but not in time to save your ranch. Legal wheels turn slowly, and you've got 36 hours left on that deadline." Storm studied Colt's face and seemed to read his intentions. "Whatever you're planning, cowboy, be careful. Crowfeet plays dirty, and he's got local law enforcement in his pocket." "Not all local law enforcement," Jake Thunderbolt said, stepping out of the shadows. "I've been listening, and I've got an idea that might even the odds." As the 4 conspirators huddled together, planning their desperate gambit. None of them noticed the small figure crouched behind the water barrel, listening to every word. Young Billy Sweetgrass slipped away into the darkness, his mind already racing with his own dangerous plan. The final showdown was approaching, and everyone in Sweetwater Creek would have a role to play. The poker game at the Territorial Hotel was invitation only, but that didn't stop half the town from finding ways to watch. Storm Nightingale had positioned her rangers discreetly around the building while Jake Thunderbolt nursed a whiskey at the bar, keeping careful watch through the saloon's connecting door. Magnolia paced the boardwalk outside, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for news. 24 hours remained until the deadline. Their entire future rested on Colt's ability to outplay 5 of the territory's most ruthless gamblers. Inside the hotel's private dining room, Colt sat, across from Harlan Crowfeet, at a felt-covered table that had seen fortunes won and lost. The other players included a railroad baron, 2 mining executives, and a cattle king man who bet more on a single hand than most people saw in a year. "Gentlemen, the stakes tonight are simple," announced the dealer, a thin man with nervous eyes. "Winner takes all. Entry fee is $100, total pot approximately $600. Colt placed his money on the table, every cent they'd raised, plus his own meager savings. If he lost this hand, Magnolia would belong to Crowfeet by law, and the town's heroic efforts would have been for nothing. The first few hands went predictably. With players testing each other's mettle through small bets and careful observation, Colt played conservatively, winning modest pots while studying his opponent's tells and habits. Harlan was aggressive but sloppy, the kind of player who relied on intimidation rather than skill. "So, cowboy," Harlan said during a brief break, his voice carrying just loud enough for others to hear, "looking forward to working my ranch? I'll need someone to tend the horses while I'll entertain my new housekeeper." Colt's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "Just deal the cards, Crowfeet." 3 hours in, the pot had grown to $800, enough to buy Magnolia's freedom with money left over. But only 3 players remained: Colt, Harlan, and the railroad baron. Maximilian Sterling. That's when Colt noticed the irregularity. Harlan's cards were coming from a slightly different position in the deck. The dealer's nervous glances toward the banker were becoming more frequent. The bastard was cheating, but calling him out without proof would accomplish nothing. Instead, Colt began counting cards, using skills he'd learned in his riverboat days to track what had been played and what remained in the deck. If Harlan was using marked cards or a stacked deck, there would be patterns. The crucial hand came. Just after midnight, Colt held 3 kings as strong hand, but not unbeatable. Harlan's confident betting suggested he held something even stronger, while Sterling folded early, claiming the stakes were too rich for his blood. "I'll see your 50 and raise you 100, Harlan declared, pushing chips forward with a smug smile. Colt studied the banker's face, noting the slight twitching of his left eye that indicated a bluffer in this case, artificial confidence. In cards he knew were coming. The deck was definitely rigged. Call, Colt said quietly, matching the bet. Harlan's smile widened as he laid down his cards with theatrical flair. Full house? Aces over eights. I believe that wins the pot, gentlemen. Not quite, Colt replied, revealing his own hand with deliberate calm. For kings. The room fell silent except for Harlan's sharp intake of breath. For kings should have. It's been impossible, given the cards already played, unless someone had been manipulating the deck. That's not possible, Harlan sputtered. The deck is marked, Colt said clearly, picking up one of the discarded cards and showing it to the light. See these tiny scratches on the corners? Someone's been cheating all night? Before anyone could respond, the dining room doors burst open. Storm Nightingale strode in with two of her rangers, followed by Jake Thunderbolt, and a crowd of townspeople led by Magnolia herself. Territorial Rangers. Storm announced, "This game is under federal investigation for fraud and conspiracy." The chaos that followed. Colt quickly swept the pot money into his hat, while the dealer confessed to his part in Harlan's scheme. The banker's protests fell on deaf ears as evidence of marked cards and rigged games came to light. $837, Colt announced to the cheering crowd outside, his voice carrying across the square like a victory bell. Magnolia threw herself into his arms, tears of joy streaming down her face. They'd done it together. The entire town had bought her freedom, saved her ranch. But the night's revelations about Harlan's criminal activities were just the beginning. Storm Nightingale's investigation would eventually uncover a network of corrupt land deals, stretching across 3 territories, making Magnolia's fight the first victory in a much larger war against organized greed. For now, though, all that mattered was the community celebration spilling into the streets of Sweetwater Creek, and the promise of a future built on love, hope, and the unshakable bonds between neighbors who refused to let injustice triumph. Dawn broke over Sweetwater Creek with the sound of hammers and saws as the entire town gathered to rebuild what Harlan Crowfeet had tried to destroy. The community barn rose from its ashes, larger and stronger than before, symbol of what people could accomplish when they stood together. Magnolia worked alongside Colt, handing him nails as he secured the roof beams. Her calloused hands were evidence of the hard work ahead, but her eyes shone with contentment she hadn't felt since her father's death. "Careful up there, Cowboy," she called, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "I didn't save you from Crowfeet's poker game just to lose you to a barn roof. Wouldn't dream of disappointing the lady who rallied an entire town," Colt replied, his grin visible even from 20 feet up. Storm Nightingale approached, leading her horse and preparing to depart with her rangers. The investigation had uncovered enough evidence to ensure Harlan would spend the next decade in territorial prison, his illegal land empire crumbling faster than his marked cards. "Miss Bell," the captain said, extending her hand, "it's been an honor. Your father would be proud, not just of your courage, but of the community he helped build here. Thank you, Captain, for everything." Magnolia clasped the ranger's hand firmly. "Will we see you again? Count on it." Word's already spreading about what happened here. Other towns facing similar situations are asking for help. You've started something important. As Storm mounted her horse, Esperanza Morales emerged from the crowd carrying a beautifully wrapped package. "For the road, Captain, some of my special empanadas and dulce de leche." "You're too kind, Senora." Storm secured the package in her saddlebags. "Take care of each other, friends. What you've built here is rarer than gold." The rangers departed, in a cloud of dust, leaving the townspeople to continue their barn raising. By noon, the structure was nearly complete. The women had set up tables laden with food for the workers. Judge Hartwell climbed onto a wooden crate to address the gathering. "Friends, before we celebrate, we have official business to conclude." He pulled out a legal document with elaborate seals. "By the power vested in me by the territorial government, I hereby declare the Wildflower Ranch officially transferred to the Sweetwater Creek Community Trust, with Miss Magnolia Bell as its permanent steward and administrator." The crowd erupted in cheers, but the judge held up his hand for silence. "Furthermore, given the extraordinary circumstances of this case and its resolution. The territorial legislature has voted to repeal the archaic law that allowed property claims over unmarried women. Miss Bell's fight has freed not just herself, but countless other women across the territory. Magnolia felt tears of joy streaming down her face as the full impact of their victory became clear. They hadn't just saved one ranch, they'd changed an unjust system forever, as the celebration continued around them. Colt climbed down from the roof and approached her with uncharacteristic nervousness. "Maggie, there's something I've been wanting to ask you. Since the first day I saw you racing your horse through town." He dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold ring from his vest pocket. "I know I'm just a cowboy without much to offer except my heart and these two hands. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day of my life making you glad you said yes." The entire town fell silent, waiting for her answer. Magnolia looked around at the faces of her friends and neighbors, people who had risked their own security to fight for her freedom, who had shown her what community really meant. "Colt Maverick," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the square. "I've loved you since we were children, and I'll love you until the stars fall from the sky. Yes, I'll marry you not because I have to, but because I choose to." The celebration that erupted made their previous victory party seem quiet by comparison. Someone produced a fiddle, others brought out guitars and harmonicas. And soon the new barn echoed with music and laughter. As the sun set over Sweetwater Creek painting, the sky in shades of rose and gold, Colt and Magnolia danced their first dance as an engaged couple. Around them, the community that had fought so hard for their happiness swayed to the music. Children played between the dancers' feet, and elderly couples smiled at memories of their own courtships. "So what happens now?" Colt asked, spinning Magnolia around the makeshift dance floor. She smiled up at him, her eyes bright with dreams and determination. "Now we build the life we choose together, with these people in this place we call home." Ah! The music played on into the night, carrying across the prairie like a promise. In Sweetwater Creek, love had triumphed over greed, community over corruption, and hope over despair. The cowboy may have lost the first bid, but in the end, he'd won something far more valuable, a lifetime with the woman brave. Enough to rally an entire town to buy back her own freedom, and they all lived happily ever after. In the truest sense of those magical words,